In the summer of 1942, the Nazi war machine was still surging east. After the fall of Kiev and the collapse of Soviet defenses in Crimea, Hitler believed the Red Army was finished. The campaign that followed was supposed to be quick, a sweeping push south to seize Soviet oil fields and deliver the economic death blow to Stalin's regime. But Hitler wasn't just thinking about oil. He wanted revenge, prestige, a symbol, and that symbol was Stalingrad, a city named after his greatest enemy, Joseph Stalin. The plan was part of Operation Blue, a two-pronged strategy dividing German army groups south into two. One would move southeast into the Caucasus toward the oil-rich fields of Baku. The other, Army Group B, led by General Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army, was tasked with taking the city on the Volga. Hitler's obsession with the name clouded his judgment. His commanders advised against splitting forces. He didn't listen. In August 1942, German aircraft from the Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet bombed Stalingrad with such intensity that over 40,000 civilians died in the opening days. The Volga River itself was choked with bodies. Buildings burned for days. Black smoke filled the sky. One German pilot would later describe the city as a sea of fire with no end. But the Soviet Union didn't collapse. Instead, it dug in. Stalin declared the city must not fall. Order number 227 was issued. Not one step back. Any Soviet soldier who retreated without orders could be executed on the spot. Blocking units were placed behind frontline troops to shoot any who fled. Some units were given no rifles, just ammunition, and told to pick up weapons from fallen comrades. And still, they fought. German troops pushed deeper into the city's outskirts, expecting to finish the job within weeks. But Stalingrad was no ordinary battlefield. It was a nightmare of ruins, brick, concrete, fire, and smoke, stretching for miles. The Germans had superior weapons, experienced officers, and momentum, but the Soviets had something else: home soil, desperation, and a brutal willingness to absorb pain. As summer faded and September began, the battle for the city truly started. The Germans reached the Volga. They believed victory was close, but they didn't realize they had just walked into the longest, bloodiest, and most pivotal battle of the Second World War. This was not a conquest. This was a trap. By late September 1942, the Germans had taken most of the city's West Bank. But instead of collapse, they met chaos. Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a carcass. Entire neighborhoods reduced to dust. Rubble as high as rooftops. Streets buried under collapsed tram lines and twisted steel. And still, the Soviets refused to give ground. Urban warfare rewrote the rules. The Germans, trained for sweeping offensives, found themselves clawing through sewers, storm drains, and half-standing buildings. They had air superiority, but it meant little here. Every time the Luftwaffe bombed, they created new Soviet strongholds. Basements became bunkers. Craters became sniper nests. Entire regiments were lost fighting for a single intersection. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats. It was a war without fronts, a war where enemies were 5 feet away, not 5 miles, where the difference between life and death came down to who turned the corner first. And the Red Army adapted. They didn't just fight. They disappeared into the terrain, into shadows, into silence. The Soviets used what they called the hugging tactic, clinging close to German lines to neutralize artillery and airstrikes. If the Germans bombed, they bombed their own. So the battle became personal. Bayonets, hand grenades, pistols fired from inches away. In some buildings, Germans held the first floor, Soviets the second, and both sides dropped grenades through holes in the floorboards. One Soviet soldier later recalled, "We fought in rooms, not streets. You'd take a kitchen in the morning, lose the bathroom by noon, and be back in the living room by nightfall." At the heart of this hell were the factories, Red October, Barikady, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor plant. They became fortresses. Assembly lines once used for tractors now churned out T-34 tanks, sometimes driven straight from the floor into battle. Soviet workers labored under fire. Some never left. A single shell could kill 50. Still, they kept building, and the snipers came. Vasily Zaitsev, a humble hunter from the Urals, turned his rifle into legend. From the ruins, he picked off German soldiers one by one, officers, gunners, tank crews. He used corpses for camouflage, moved only at night. His kill count soared. The Germans were so rattled they sent in their own elite marksmen to take him down. But Zaitsev survived, and the city endured. By October, the Germans had taken 90% of Stalingrad, but that last 10%, those final blocks near the Volga, refused to fall. And behind the river, Soviet commanders were planning something that would turn the entire war upside down. As the Germans poured men and machines into the ruins of Stalingrad, they believed they were on the verge of final victory. Soviet defenders were cornered against the Volga. Supplies were low, ammunition was rationed, and yet the Red Army did not break, because the real Soviet strategy wasn't wasn't survival, it was entrapment. Behind the scenes, Soviet High Command, Stavka, was planning a massive counteroffensive. Stalin, Zhukov, Vasilevsky, they saw the overextension of the German Sixth Army for what it was, an opportunity. The Germans were so fixated on Stalingrad that they had left their flanks exposed, guarded not by seasoned Wehrmacht troops, but by overstretched Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian divisions. Poorly equipped, thinly spread, vulnerable, the Soviet plan was codenamed Operation Uranus. It was audacious. Instead of attacking the city itself, the Red Army would strike north and south of Stalingrad, aiming to encircle the entire German force. Over 1 million Soviet troops, some hidden hundreds of kilometers away, would be launched like a vice, crashing into the weak outer edges of Hitler's line. The Germans didn't see it coming. Their high command had underestimated Soviet capabilities. Berlin's attention was still focused on the oil fields of the Caucasus. Even warnings from German generals on the ground were dismissed. Hitler was obsessed with taking the city named after Stalin. He wanted it crushed, personally. He refused to consider retreat, refused to reinforce the flanks, refused to adapt. So the Soviets moved silently into position. In the early hours of November 19, 1942, a storm of artillery erupted along the northern front near the Don River. Temperatures had plummeted. Blizzards blinded both sides, but through the snow came tens of thousands of Red Army troops, backed by tanks, rocket launchers, and field artillery. The Romanian lines collapsed almost immediately. Within 24 hours, the Soviets had broken through. The next day, they struck from the south. By November 23rd, the two Soviet pincers linked up at the town of Kalach, 70 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The trap had closed. Over 300,000 Axis troops, including the elite German Sixth Army, were encircled. Surrounded in the frozen ruins they thought they had conquered. The Germans called it Der Kessel, the cauldron. But this wasn't just a trap. It was a death sentence, cut off from supplies, exposed to the Russian winter. And still, Hitler forbade them to retreat. He ordered them to hold their ground, to fight to the last man, and they would. By the end of November 1942, the once dominant German Sixth Army was encircled. Over 300,000 Axis soldiers, German, Romanian, Croatian, and others, trapped in a bombed-out city with no supplies, no escape, and no plan. What followed inside the frozen ring of Stalingrad was not a battle. It was a slow-motion collapse. Temperatures plunged below minus 30 degrees Celsius. Soldiers lacked winter clothing. Vehicles seized up. Guns jammed. Food rations dwindled from meager to non-existent. Men boiled leather belts for soup. Horses were slaughtered. Snow was melted for water. Frostbite spread like disease, claiming fingers, toes, and morale. The wounded froze in their sleep. Medical supplies ran out. Amputations were performed without anesthesia, if they were performed at all. Outside the ring, Soviet forces tightened the noose. They hammered every attempt by the Luftwaffe to supply the cauldron from the air. Goering had promised Hitler that the trapped army could be sustained by airlift, an absurd claim that would prove catastrophic. The Luftwaffe needed to deliver 500 tons of supplies per day. On average, it managed barely 80. Most planes never reached the drop zones. Some crashed on takeoff. Others were destroyed mid-air by Soviet anti-aircraft fire. Fuel ran dry. Paratroopers dropped into the wrong sectors. What little made it in was often stolen, lost, or spoiled by the cold. And yet, inside the city, Hitler demanded a stand. In December, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, a desperate attempt to break through from the southwest. For a moment, it seemed possible. German tanks advanced within 30 miles of the encirclement, but Paulus, still awaiting orders from Hitler, refused to attempt a breakout. The chance slipped away. Manstein was pushed back. Stalingrad was sealed shut. In a desperate attempt to maintain order, German commanders distributed medals for bravery, iron crosses pinned to frostbitten uniforms. Soldiers were ordered to dig trenches into ground frozen like granite. Some obeyed. Others simply sat, silent and skeletal, staring into the snow. There were no more illusions, no more conquests. The Sixth Army was dying, not in battle, but in cold, in hunger, and in silence. And still, Hitler ordered them to hold, because for him, surrender was unthinkable. As the new year dawned in January 1943, the situation in Stalingrad became unbearable. German soldiers were buried under snow and rubble, sleeping in cellars packed with the dead and dying. The stench of rotting flesh lingered through corridors of ice. Frostbite turned limbs black. Dysentery spread from one man to another. And through it all, Soviet artillery pounded the cauldron day and night. Thousands of shells per hour, unrelenting. At the center of this frozen nightmare stood General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army. He was methodical, loyal, and by nature, cautious. But now, Paulus was paralyzed, trapped not just by Soviet forces, but by Hitler himself. Repeated requests for permission to retreat or break out had been denied. Hitler demanded that Stalingrad be held at all costs, and Paulus obeyed. Even as his men starved, even as morale disintegrated, even as the Soviets closed in. Paulus was promoted to Field Marshal on January 30th, 1943. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler made the promotion with a clear message: die with honor. That same day, Hitler broadcast a speech to the German people commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Nazi rise to power. He claimed that the Wehrmacht still held Stalingrad and that victory was close. It was a lie. Inside the city, Paulus knew the truth. He commanded barely 90,000 survivors. Most were wounded, sick, or too weak to fight. Ammunition was gone, rations reduced to one slice of bread a day, sometimes made with sawdust. They had no tanks, no fuel, no hope. But he still refused to defy Hitler's orders. The Soviets knew it was over. They offered terms, humane treatment for surrender. Still, Paulus held on. On January 31st, 1943, Soviet troops finally breached the last command bunker. They found Paulus sitting in silence, exhausted, his uniform frayed and eyes hollow. When told he had been captured, he reportedly muttered, "I have no intention of shooting myself for that Bohemian corporal." It was over, at least in the south, but in the northern pocket of the city, one last German resistance remained. They would not last long. Even after General Paulus surrendered the southern sector, fighting continued in the north. There, under General Karl Strecker, around 11,000 German soldiers still clung to life in the rubble near the Traktorny and Barakati factories. Cut off, frozen, starving, and nearly out of ammunition, they had received no orders to surrender. Instead, they held their ground in the ruins. These last defenders fought in total isolation. Communications with German high command were sporadic at best. Food was virtually non-existent. The wounded lay stacked in hospital corridors, untreated. Field medics worked without morphine. The dead were used as insulation. Bodies placed against windows and doors to keep out the cold. The Soviets, knowing this was the last holdout, unleashed hell. Artillery bombarded the factories 24 hours a day. Flamethrowers and grenades cleared bunkers floor by floor. Loudspeakers blared messages: "You are surrounded. You will be treated humanely. Lay down your arms." Some Germans responded with machine gun fire. Others simply didn't have the strength to lift their weapons anymore. Desperation gave way to madness. One Soviet officer recalled storming a basement to find German soldiers huddled in silence, covered in lice, eyes sunken, barely registering his presence. No resistance, just the dull awareness that death was preferable to freezing another night. Some tried to escape across the frozen Volga. Most were gunned down or sank beneath the ice. General Strecker finally surrendered on February 2nd, 1943. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of the original 300,000 Axis troops encircled, only 91,000 surrendered, and fewer than 6,000 would ever return home. The rest perished from cold, wounds, starvation, or in Soviet captivity. It was the single largest surrender in German military history, but it wasn't just a military defeat. It was a psychological one. The myth of Nazi invincibility had been shattered, and the world had just witnessed the turning of the tide. When the Soviet forces rounded up the surviving Germans, they did not find soldiers. They found shadows. The men who surrendered at Stalingrad were skeletal, frostbitten, delirious with hunger. Some could barely walk. Many could no longer speak. Their eyes were vacant, their uniforms ragged. Some collapsed during the march into captivity, never to rise again. These were not prisoners of war in the traditional sense. They were walking corpses. The Soviets took roughly 91,000 prisoners, among them 24 generals and thousands of officers. But over the next few weeks, hunger and exposure claimed tens of thousands more. The wounded received minimal care. Medical resources were strained to the breaking point, and the Soviet winter showed no mercy. The marches were brutal. Prisoners trudged through snow for days with no food, sleeping on frozen ground, collapsing from exhaustion. Guards sometimes shot those who fell behind. Others simply died quietly, disappearing beneath snowdrifts. The surviving prisoners were sent to camps spread across the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, Siberia, the Urals. There, they faced years of forced labor. Many would die building roads, cutting timber, or mining coal. Disease ran rampant. Tuberculosis, typhus, and dysentery decimated entire camps. One Soviet doctor described it bluntly: "These are not men. These are skeletons with boots." Out of the 91,000 taken at Stalingrad, only around 5,000 to 6,000 ever returned to Germany, and many not until 1955, over a decade after the war ended. They came back to a country that had moved on, a West Germany rebuilding under new leadership and an East Germany under Soviet control. For the returnees, reintegration was difficult. Many were haunted by trauma, both physical and psychological. Some had no families left. Others were accused of cowardice or collaboration. One survivor wrote, "Stalingrad never left us. We left our bodies there, even if our bones still moved." And then there was Friedrich Paulus, the man who had refused to defy Hitler, who had led the Sixth Army into disaster, was treated relatively well by the Soviets. He lived in a dacha near Moscow, gave interviews, and testified at the Nuremberg trials. In 1953, he moved to East Germany and lived out his days quietly, dying in 1957. But the ghosts of Stalingrad lived on. They lived in the snow-covered ruins, in the unmarked graves across Russia, and in the broken minds of the few who survived. While history remembers the soldiers, the uniforms, and the commanders, what's often forgotten is the city itself. Stalingrad was home to over 400,000 civilians before the German invasion. By the time the battle ended, fewer than 10,000 remained alive. The rest had fled, been evacuated, or were killed in the inferno. For the civilians who stayed behind, life in Stalingrad was nothing short of hell. In August 1942, when the Luftwaffe unleashed its first air raid on the city, firestorms tore through entire neighborhoods. Bombs ignited oil depots and factories, turning the skyline black. One Soviet report described how the air turned to fire. Whole families suffocated in basements as the flames sucked out the oxygen. Others were crushed beneath collapsing buildings. And that was just the beginning. As the battle moved into the city, civilians found themselves trapped in a war zone with no food, no water, no shelter. They lived in cellars filled with rats, shared scraps with soldiers, and faced constant shelling. There were no front lines, just shifting zones of horror. At any moment, a sniper's bullet or an artillery shell could find them. The winter made it worse. Temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Without fuel, civilians burned furniture, books, even clothing to survive. Many froze in their sleep. Children starved. Mothers went mad with grief. Eyewitnesses describe scenes that defy comprehension. People eating glue, wallpaper paste, or anything remotely edible. Others simply gave up, sitting motionless in the snow until death arrived. And yet, even in this chaos, there was defiance. Women volunteered as nurses. Children acted as messengers or helped dig trenches. Entire families joined the defense effort, barricading streets or passing ammunition to Soviet troops. One 17-year-old girl named Zinaida Maraseva was posthumously honored for rallying wounded soldiers and leading a counterattack. But the toll was staggering. When the battle ended, Soviet officials reported a city reduced to rubble. Not a single building stood untouched. Infrastructure was obliterated. Hospitals were overflowing with the wounded and dying. The Volga River was filled with corpses, frozen beneath sheets of ice. Stalingrad was not just a battlefield, it was a mass grave. And yet, from this devastation, Soviet propaganda would soon craft a symbol of resilience, one that glorified sacrifice, but rarely acknowledged the price paid by the nameless, the forgotten, and the innocent. In the aftermath of Stalingrad, both sides rushed to shape the narrative. Stalin's regime declared it the ultimate triumph of the Soviet people, proof that socialism was stronger than fascism. In Nazi Germany, the defeat was at first downplayed, then blamed on everything from the weather to betrayal, never on the High Command's catastrophic miscalculations. But beyond the propaganda, Stalingrad changed the war. It shattered the illusion of Nazi invincibility. The Wehrmacht had been stopped before, at Moscow, at Leningrad, but Stalingrad was different. It was total defeat. An entire army, hundreds of thousands of men, destroyed or captured. Germany would never fully recover from that blow. From this point forward, the Reich was on the defensive. For the Soviets, the victory was Pyrrhic. The Red Army had proven its resilience and tactical ingenuity, but at a staggering cost. Estimates vary, but Soviet casualties likely exceeded 1 million, including the dead, wounded, and missing. It was a victory soaked in blood, made possible only through unimaginable sacrifice. The lessons of Stalingrad were brutal. Urban warfare was revealed to be a grinding nightmare, where tanks became coffins and infantry faced death at every corner. Logistics, fuel, food, ammunition proved more important than ideology or brute strength. And perhaps the greatest lesson, never underestimate the will to resist, especially when the fight is on home soil. But myths crept in quickly. The Soviet Union portrayed the battle as a model of unity and heroism. The truth was messier. Orders like Stalin's Order number 227, not one step back, led to executions of retreating soldiers. Penal battalions were thrown into suicidal charges. Entire divisions were sacrificed for single blocks of terrain. Morality was often drowned in necessity. For Germany, Stalingrad became a symbol of martyrdom. Nazi propaganda labeled the Sixth Army as betrayed by fate, ignored by allies, and punished for loyalty. But the real betrayal came from Berlin, from a leader who refused to face reality, who condemned hundreds of thousands to die in a city he never saw. Generals studied Stalingrad for decades after the war. It was picked apart in military academies, used as a case study in both what to do and what never to repeat. It became a warning, a benchmark, a legend. But legends by their nature distort. Stalingrad was not a clean, noble turning point. It was a descent into madness. And while nations remembered victory or defeat, the soldiers and civilians who lived through it remembered only survival, if they remembered anything at all. Long after the last shots were fired, Stalingrad refused to be silent. The city, renamed Volgograd in 1961, was rebuilt, but the scars never faded. To this day, bones are still uncovered during construction. Entire families lie entombed beneath beneath modern buildings. In 1943, the Soviets erected the first memorials. By the 1960s, they built Mamayev Kurgan, a colossal complex crowned by the statue, The Motherland Calls. It stands over 85 meters tall, sword raised, mouth open in eternal cry. But monuments are only echoes. The real legacy of Stalingrad lives in its warnings. It reminds us what happens when war becomes ideology, when leaders trade lives for pride, when cities become chessboards and people become statistics. The battle was not fought for strategic advantage alone. It became a symbol for Hitler, a gateway to the East, for Stalin, a line that could not be crossed, and for history, a moment where everything changed. The cost, unthinkable. Historians estimate nearly 2 million total casualties. Every minute of the battle, someone died. Every hour, a street changed hands. Every day, families were destroyed. And in the end, nothing was won that couldn't have been lost again. Stalingrad became a turning point not because of territory, but because of psychology. It broke the myth of German superiority and birthed the myth of Soviet resilience. It galvanized the Allies, inspired resistance movements, and signaled the long, bloody crawl toward Berlin. But more than anything, it showed the world what modern warfare truly meant. Steel and fire, ice and starvation, cities erased, morality suspended, and still, people fought for their comrades, for their homes, for a future they weren't sure would come. The snow has long since melted from the streets of Stalingrad, but its blood remains, frozen in memory, etched in stone, and whispered in every corner of a world that promises never again.